Hey sports fans, I just thought I'd show you this because when I was mentioning it on the part 1 of this video series, what I was talking about was out of frame, and I was speaking about how to tell which is your inside and which is your outside brake pad if you just kind of took the car apart and just laid the pieces down and couldn't remember how they went back. Now, as I mentioned on that Lexus, both the inside and the outside brake pads are the same. And then, as you may or may not be able to see here, both of these brake pads, okay, and all of the brake pads in this set had the same number on them. Now that may or may not mean anything, but it's going to give you pretty good confidence that the inside brake pad is the same as the outside. But sometimes it's obvious, like on this Chrysler rear brake assembly, it's obvious what's the inside and outside. This has got some tangs that'll go in the hole on the piston for the brake caliper, and the outside one has got these tangs on it where it just clips over the edge. So it's obvious which is inside and which is outside on those, so you'd never have a problem. Sometimes there'll be a more subtle difference between the inside and the outside. If you just took the old pads off and laid them down, and then you had the box of new pads, and you notice a slight difference from one to the other, you'd be wondering what is the inside and what is the outside brake pad. Here I have a caliper off a 1-ton GM truck, and I don't have the pads anymore, but I just made this mock-up out of a piece of cardboard here. The way you can tell what was your inside and what was your outside brake pad is you take your used brake pads and you look at them. It'll make a pattern there. The inside one will touch the caliper piston, okay, and it'll make a round, stain of dirt and rust there. So you'll be able to tell that was the inside one. And then on the outside brake pad, it'll make a pattern similar to where the outside there of the brake caliper, or where it would rest against the brake caliper, and it'll have a mark similar to that on the outside brake pad. And then you can just take your used brake pads with these patterns, these stain patterns on them, and compare them to your new brake pads, and you'll easily be able to tell which is the inside and the outside brake pad. All right, let's take a look at the brake fluid level on this car. You can see here that it's actually quite low. Now, for our purposes right now, that's a good thing, because we're going to press those brake caliper pistons back into their bore, which will make that brake fluid level rise. If this brake fluid master cylinder here, the reservoir on it, was filled to the top, we would have to remove some of that brake fluid so it didn't overflow. And on this car, it's even more important because with this engine cover assembly here, you wouldn't even be able to clean up the mess you made. And that brake fluid laying on paint, and it makes things rust because it attracts water and it destroys paint. It can destroy plastic. So it's something you want to be very careful about. So you want to make sure you check the level of your master cylinder before you press your brake caliper pistons back into their bore, because you do not want to have that overflow, particularly on a new car where it would be just about impossible to clean everything up without taking a whole bunch of stuff apart. Okay, now like I say, there's an upside to topping off your master cylinder. You have a little bit more, well, actually quite a bit more brake fluid in reserve in the event that you ever had a hole anywhere in your brakes hydraulic system. So you'd be able to probably bring your car to a stop without running out of brake fluid in that situation. So there, it's a plus. But then if it is topped off and you're replacing brakes that have been quite worn, you have to suck the excess brake fluid out of that master cylinder, or you'll just have a big mess. So bear in mind. And the other thing I want to mention to you, as soon as you are done pressing your brake caliper pistons back into their bore and you got your brakes on, your brake pads on and assembled, make sure you come back, check the fluid level on your master cylinder. If it needs any, you can put a little bit in. But most importantly, make sure you put this cap back on. You know, you get so involved in doing your brake job that you forget little things like, well, it's possible for you to forget little things like, oh, we took off that master cylinder cap. So you want to make sure you put that back on, and it's just darn easy to forget. Okay, at this point we're going to attempt to squeeze our brake caliper piston back into its bore. And I do want to show you one thing here. When I was talking earlier about you know, how you can tell which brake pad went where, if they are different, if the inside one is different than the outside one, and you can't remember which is which. You see that circular pattern of dirt and rust there, and see that caliper piston, it's circular. So this was the inside brake pad, and you see that dirt and rust combination there. It pretty much looks like that. So you know that's the outside one. Okay, matches up. Okay, just a little tip there for in case you ever are in a situation where you don't know which brake pad is which, and they're different. Now, we're going to squeeze this back into the bore. I always used to use a C-clamp for this, but I saw a guy use these on a video once, use some channel lock pliers, and it's a little bit faster, so I've been doing that recently. The old C-clamp does work just fine, but I kind of like doing this just because I don't have to futz around unscrewing that C-clamp, so it's wide enough to fit. That takes a certain amount of time. This is just easier. Okay, now the new brake pads, you gotta push this all the way back into the bore. You want to be careful, and this is one of the advantages using a C-clip in or a C-clamp in your old brake pad to press that back in. You'll be a lot less likely to damage that boot. You want to make sure you don't pinch that boot. You also want to make sure once it's all squeezed back, that boot has collapsed properly and evenly, okay? One word of caution here also, particularly if you had a really rusty car that's been a while since brake job's been done and everything's rusty and cruddy, these brake caliper pistons, they can get rusty and they can stick in one place once you apply the brake. It'll be just like the brakes are being applied at all times, and you can ruin a perfectly new set of brakes and rotor because it'd be like driving with the brake on all the time. If you want to make sure that doesn't happen, you can just put on remanufactured calipers right away or rebuild them. But the way I do it is I push the caliper piston back in, I put the car together, I go take it for a test drive. I use the brakes very sparingly because I don't want to get hot from braking. And I pretty much just do straight on driving with using the brakes very little. And then I will get out after, you know, driving at about 10 miles and just feel if the wheel got hot or the rotor got hot. Now be careful because it could be hot. You touch that rotor and this brake caliper was stuck, so the brakes were essentially applied. You'll burn your finger before you even know it. So just be a little careful. What I do is I touch the wheel to see if it's warm. If it's not getting warm when I haven't been doing a lot of braking, chances are this caliper has not hung up or stuck. So that's just something you want to keep in mind. It's also the reason why you grease up those slide pins to make sure everything retracts. And as long as we're talking about retracting, these little spring clips that are so easy to forget, make sure you put them back in. Now, let's say you lost one. Or let's say one, I've seen it where they rust out and they just break. I've also seen it where they've lost their spring tension in there. They're really not much of a spring anymore. And you want to get your car back together and drive. I wouldn't be afraid to assemble the car without these. And since they're there for a reason, I would go to an auto parts store and get one as soon as I could, but I wouldn't be afraid to put the car back together and drive it and put those back on, you know, after I acquired some new ones. But they're there for a reason, so we put them back on. Now, we have squeezed this brake caliper piston back into its bore. Now let's take a look at what I was talking about before. Now, you notice how you can see that brake fluid now? Now that I squeeze that brake caliper piston back into its bore, the level of brake fluid in that master cylinder has risen. And it'll rise even more when we do the other side. That is why you have to be conscious about this. And you should check the level of your brake fluid in your master cylinder before you press those pistons back into their bore. And once again, make sure you remember to put your brake master cylinder cap back on before you say that job's done and you take the car for a drive. Quite often I do this when I change oil in a car. For whatever reason, there's going to be a delay in putting the oil back in. I'll put a note right on the steering wheel that says no oil. Do the same thing here. You know, make yourself a note. Tape the steering wheel. Say, replace brake master fluid cylinder cap. Okay, you don't want to forget that, because if that cap isn't on, when you step on the brakes, fluid's going to come up like that, and it'll make a mess. And like I say, brake fluid, it's not like oil. You know, you spill oil somewhere in the engine bay, big deal. You don't want to spill brake fluid in there. It's hard on plastic, it's hard on paint, and it makes things rust. Not to mention the fact that it could lead to a very dangerous situation, such as running out of brake fluid. Now, let's take a look at this master cylinder now that I press the other brake caliper back into its bore. Look at that. It's right up at the very top, damn close to overflowing. But I'm not really too concerned about it, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the cap back on it, and then I will lightly apply the brakes once everything's assembled, and it should actually put enough fluid into those brake calipers to get that down to the correct level. Okay, this will be a little bit difficult to show on the camera, but while I'm doing it, but this brake caliper here, you're going to want to have it lined up, this hole here and this hole here lined up with this slide pin here and here. And you may have to push these in. You see that, how you can push that in to get the brake caliper over the slide pins, okay? All right. I got my brake caliper pretty much in position. In order to do it, I did have to push the slide pin. The slide pin was out. I just pushed it in by hand, and then I was able to slide that over where it's supposed to be. Also, those spring pins I was talking about before, I might as well show you one more time. Here, I'll pull this up. They're going to make these brakes, that's the whole idea. You know, they want to draw them away from the rotor. So you might have to carefully kind of hold that in with your fingers while you slide that caliper over. You get that in place, and then you just press down on that slide pin, push it into the caliper, and that'll get it pretty much lined up. I got anti-seize compound on my bolts, so I'll get them started. There's that one. And there's that one. Then we will tighten them up, and for the torque spec, I'm going to have to look that up on both the caliper mounting bracket and the caliper itself. I'm just about out of battery power on my camera anyway, so I'm going to have to go inside and get a different battery. And at that point, I will look that up on my computer. I do not have the book for this particular car, so I don't have the torque specs handy for me out here in the shed. But the other thing too is, if you've been doing any amount of mechanical work, you can pretty much just guess what the torque should be. The only reason I mention it is because it's the proper way to do things, is to torque it to the proper torque. And you know, why make a video unless you're going to show people how to do things properly? So we got that, and we got to put final torque on our caliper bracket bolts, and then at that point, we're all done with this side, and the other side is exactly the same. All right, I looked up the torque specs on this car's brake calipers, and I've seen some conflicting information, but the general consensus seems to be for the bracket that holds the caliper on is 80 pounds. So that's what we're going to go to. I've seen 78, 79 pounds. I'm not worried about 1 pound. There it is, click. Because chances are your torque wrench isn't calibrated that sensitively anyway. So if I see something that says 79 pounds, I'm not afraid to go 80, okay? Now, the smaller bolts that actually hold the brake caliper onto the brake caliper mounting bracket, the general consensus of what I've seen on the internet for that is 25 pounds. By the way, the larger bolts that hold on the brake caliper bracket were 17 millimeter. I don't think I mentioned that before. And the smaller bolts that hold the brake caliper to the brake caliper bracket are 14 millimeter. Theoretically, that's what they'll be on your car. They may be different depending on what has been replaced. But 25 foot-pounds for these smaller bolts. At least that's what I've seen on the internet. Okay, at this point, this job is more or less done. It's just a matter of putting our wheel back on and taking it for a test drive.